When the guns of the Great War at last fell silent, explorers and soldiers returned to the wasteland of Verdun. They stumbled upon a section of trench unlike any other in the history of warfare. Sticking straight up from the earth, in a perfect, haunting alignment, was a row of rifles. Their bayonets were still fixed, pointing toward the sky, and below them, entombed in the mud, lay an entire French unit. The legend was born. They had been buried alive, standing at their posts, defiant to the very end. To understand the trench, you must first erase your understanding of a battlefield. Forget maneuver. Forget strategy. Forget the heroic charge. You must instead understand the place. Verdun. It was not a battle, not in the sense that Agincourt or Waterloo were battles, defined by a single day, a decisive charge, or a brilliant flanking move. It was an event, a 10-month industrial process designed for a single monstrous purpose, the annihilation of a generation. It was a factory of death, running day and night, consuming men as fuel and producing only mud, craters, and ghosts. To comprehend the sacrifice of the trench of bayonets, one must first be willing to walk, metaphorically, through the inferno that forged it, a circle of hell conceived in the cold, precise mind of one man. The year was 1916. The Great War, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914, had instead devoured millions of lives. It had stagnated, settling into the agonizing muddy stalemate of the trenches, a static war of barbed wire, machine guns, and seemingly meaningless slaughter. The high commands on all sides, trapped in their chateaux far from the front, desperate to break the deadlock, searched for a decisive blow, a masterstroke that would finally end the suffering. For the German Chief of Staff, General Erich von Falkenhayn, this masterstroke would not be a breakthrough. It would be a bleed. Falkenhayn was a creature of cold, ruthless logic. He looked at the map of the Western Front and saw a single point of such profound, agonizing, irrational importance to the French psyche that they would be compelled to defend it to the last man, the fortified city of Verdun. Verdun was not just a fortress, it was a symbol. It was the ancient gateway to Paris, a bastion against German aggression since the days of Attila the Hun, the very heart of French national pride. To lose Verdun would be to lose the soul of France. Falkenhayn knew this, and he counted on it. His plan, later revealed in his memoirs, though his true, precise intentions are still furiously debated by historians, was a masterpiece of calculated, cold-blooded cruelty. Some argue he genuinely sought a breakthrough, others that he was trying to give the German crown prince a prestigious victory. But the most chilling interpretation, and the one that best fits the evidence, is that he did not intend to capture Verdun, at least not at first. The capture of the city was a secondary, almost irrelevant objective. He intended to use it as bait. He would attack Verdun, forcing the French High Command, under General Joffre, to pour every available man, every last reserve, into its defence. He would then use his vastly superior artillery, concentrated on an impossibly narrow front, to systematically, scientifically, and impersonally destroy those men. The plan was not to defeat the French army in the field. It was to kill it, to bleach France white, as the chilling phrase attributed to him goes. It was attrition warfare, not as an unfortunate byproduct of battle, but as the central, naked, horrifying objective. On the morning of February 21, 1916, Operation Judgment, Unternehmen Gericht, began. The storm broke over the heads of the unprepared French defenders with a violence that had no precedent in human history. The French soldiers in their trenches were not prepared for what was about to happen. They were relatively new to this sector, holding a line that was considered quiet. And then the sky fell. For 9 solid hours, over 1,200 German guns, heavy mortars, massive naval guns brought in by rail, long-range cannons, and thousands of field pieces pounded a tiny 8-mile sector of the French lines. The noise was not a series of explosions. It was a single, continuous, deafening roar, a physical weight that crushed the senses, a noise heard over 100 miles away in the Saarland. It was Trommelfeuer, drumfire. It was the sound of the world ending. Soldiers caught in that bombardment did not simply die. They were atomized. They were pulverized. They vanished. Trenches, forests, and farmhouses were erased from the earth, leaving only a churning, smoking sea of mud and fire. This was just the first day. The battle would last for over 300 days. 300 days and 300 nights of relentless attack and desperate counterattack. The Germans introduced new horrors to this front, like the phosgene gas shell, which choked the life from defenders, and the terrifying Flammenwerfer, the flamethrower, which turned trenches into screaming pits of liquid fire. The French response, galvanized by the arrival of General Philippe Pétain, was summed up in a single, desperate, stubborn phrase that would become the motto of the entire nation. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. To ensure they did not pass, Pétain organized the Sacred Way, the Voie Sacrée, a single, narrow, 73-kilometre road into Verdun. Down this artery, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a constant, grinding stream of trucks, thousands of them, wheel to wheel, one every 14 seconds, ferried men into the mincing machine and carried the wounded, the lucky ones, out. This single road became the lifeline of France, a logistical miracle that fed the furnace. The battle became a vortex. It became the identity of France. It sucked in divisions from across the French and German empires, churning them into ruin and spitting out the shattered survivors. This was, above all, a war of materiel. The statistics are so vast they become meaningless, numbers that simply numb the mind. Historians and statisticians still struggle to agree on the exact figures, but the estimates are astronomical. Some sources suggest 40 million shells were fired over the course of the battle. Others argue the true figure is closer to 60 million. 60 million high-explosive shells fired into an area roughly the size of a small city. The landscape itself died. Forests, like the Bois des Cours, were reduced to blackened splintered stumps, ghostly skeletons protruding from the mud. Villages, like Fleury-devant-Douaumont, vanished. They were not just destroyed, they were erased. The ground was so thoroughly churned that in some places the topsoil was composed more of steel fragments than of earth. Farmers today still call it the Zone Rouge, the red zone, where the soil remains toxic and unexploded ordnance makes ploughing a deadly gamble. And the human cost. This was Falkenhayn's true metric. This was the ledger of Operation Judgment. By the end of the 10 months, the total casualties, the killed, the wounded, the captured, and the missing, would climb to staggering heights. The most conservative estimates place the combined losses at over 700,000 men. Other credible analyses push the figure past 900,000, perhaps even approaching 1 million souls. The truth is, no one knows. No one can know. At Verdun, men did not just die. They vanished. They were buried alive in collapsing dugouts, sucked down into the liquid mud of shell craters, obliterated by direct hits from heavy shells that left no trace, no dog tag, no button. They became, quite literally, part of the soil. And for those who survived, the cost was different. This battle gave the world a new, terrible term for an ancient horror: shell shock. Men were driven mad by the continuous bombardment, by the constant thrumsing vibration of the earth, by the unending proximity to death, by the absolute powerlessness of sitting in a hole while the universe exploded around them. They developed uncontrollable tremors, paralyses, the inability to speak, the inability to stop screaming. They were haunted by the 1,000-yard stare, their eyes reflecting a horror they could never unsee, never communicate. They lived in filth, in trenches half full of freezing water and human waste, surrounded by the corpses of their comrades in various states of decay, battling swarms of rats that grew fat on the dead. This was the world that existed for 10 months. This was the furnace. This was the hell of Verdun. And into this furnace, in the dying, desperate days of spring, 1916, marched the men of the 137th Infantry Regiment, assigned to a god-forsaken patch of ground that would soon become immortal. June 1916. The furnace of Verdun, having already consumed hundreds of thousands of men, demanded more. Falkenhayn's mincing machine was not slowing down. It was accelerating. The initial 9-hour bombardment back in February now seemed like a distant, almost quaint memory, replaced by a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute routine of shelling that had become the normalized, terrifying soundtrack to existence. The Germans, frustrated by the stubborn, almost irrational French defence, prepared another massive push, a final Sturm designed to break the deadlock. This time, they would not merely probe. They would aim for the final line of defence, the last crumbling ridges that stood between their stormtroopers and the city of Verdun itself. And into this specific designated inferno, this epicentre of the coming storm, marched the men of the 137th Infantry Regiment, le 137e Régiment d'Infanterie. These were not the elite shock troops of the French army, not the Diables Bleus, the Chasseurs Alpins, or the hardened professionals of the Foreign Legion. They were, for the most part, reservists. Territorial. Men in their late 20s, their 30s, some already in their early 40s, men who had lives before this war. They were pulled from the ancient, stubborn, pious heartlands of Western France, the Vendée and Brittany. They were farmers who knew the scent of salt from the Atlantic and the feel of the soil, fishermen who knew the tides, carpenters, bakers, and blacksmiths who had been torn from their families. They were fathers, they were husbands, they were men who had already served, who had seen the horrors of trench warfare on other, quieter fronts, and had now been pulled back into the line, their horizon blue greatcoats patched and caked with the mud of a dozen other forgotten battlefields. They were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel de Rigny. They were tired. They were veterans, which in 1916 simply meant they had not yet been killed. They were, perhaps, too exhausted to be anything other than resigned. But they were also Bretons and Vendéans, men from regions known throughout the French army for a near fatalistic stubbornness, a rock-ribbed resilience, and a deep, quiet piety that was often mistaken for simple-mindedness. They were precisely the kind of men who would follow an order to the letter, even if that order was an unambiguous sentence of death. They were the men who would hold. Their assigned position was, even by the nightmarish standards of Verdun, a place of profound horror. It was not a fortress. It was not a concrete bunker. It was a shallow depression in the lunar landscape, a slight fold in the churned, pulverized earth that offered almost no real protection. It was known on the military maps as the Ravin de la Dame, the ravine of the lady, a name that dripped with a terrible, poetic irony. It was a place that funneled artillery fire, a natural killing ground where shells from multiple angles found their mark. This ravine, along with the nearby strong point of the Thiaumont farm, itself little more than a pile of rubble, formed the vital defensive line protecting Fort Souville. And Fort Souville, its concrete superstructure already pulverized by German heavy shells, was the last major fortification standing between the German army and the city of Verdun itself. If the Ravin de la Dame fell, if Thiaumont fell, then Souville would be next. And after Souville came the city. The German High Command understood this perfectly. This was the hinge. This was the point where they would apply maximum, unbearable pressure. In the first days of June, they began the preparations, unleashing a new, more scientific wave of terror. This attack would be spearheaded by the dreaded Sturmtruppen, the stormtroopers, specialized assault infantry, armed with grenades, pistols, and sharpened trench spades. And it would be preceded by a new kind of bombardment. The Germans were bringing up their heavy Minenwerfer, the trench mortars whose massive 200-pound shells didn't just explode. They liquidated the earth, obliterating trenches, collapsing dugouts, and burying men under tons of compacted mud. They were preparing to use Grünkreuz, Green Cross, phosgene gas, a new, more lethal agent than the chlorine used at Ypres, a gas that was invisible, almost odourless, with a faint smell of new-mown hay, and killed by slowly drowning a man in his own fluids, hours after he had breathed it. This was the storm that was gathering. The French command, now under General Nivelle, who had taken over direct command from Pétain, understood the stakes. The orders given to Lieutenant Colonel de Rigny and his 137th Regiment were not complicated. They were not nuanced. They were absolute. The line must be held. The Ravin de la Dame was the final bulwark. No ground was to be yielded. Tenir, hold, à tout prix, at any cost. Retreat was not an option. It was not even a possibility to be considered. The men of the 137th filed into the shattered remains of the trenches. They saw the remnants of the regiments they were relieving, the shattered bodies, the haunted eyes of the survivors who stumbled past them, back towards the safety of the rear. They took their positions on the fire step, a muddy ledge barely wide enough for a man's boot. They leaned their 8mm Label rifles against the parapet, checked the mechanisms, and fixed their long, needle-pointed, cruciform Rosalie bayonets. They stared east, into the hazy, smoking ruin of what had once been a forest, and they waited. They listened. They listened for the telltale, fluttering whistle of the incoming Minenwerfer shells, a sound that gave you only a second to dive for cover. They listened for the sharp pop of gas canisters. They listened for the end of the world. And on June 10th, 1916, it began. On June 11th, 1916, the preliminary shelling that had tormented the 137th Regiment ceased, and in the agonizing pause that followed, the men knew the real assault was coming. This was not to be a diversion. It was not a probe. This was a calculated, engineered attempt at extermination, aimed with surgical, impersonal precision at the men holding the Ravin de la Dame. The German High Command had designated this narrow, muddy sector for total, utter liquidation. The air, previously filled with the random chaotic noise of a generalized bombardment, suddenly changed. It filled with a new, terrifying, fluttering whistle, a sound that rose in pitch until it became a shriek. This was the signature of the heavy Minenwerfer, the German trench mortars, whose specific, dreadful purpose was not merely to kill men with shrapnel, but to physically dismantle the very earth they stood upon. These were not conventional artillery shells. They were colossal 9-inch caliber projectiles, weighing hundreds of pounds filled with high explosives. They were designed for high-angle fire, to be dropped almost vertically into the deep, narrow trenches that conventional flat-trajectory field guns could not reach. They did not explode outwards in a flat horizontal spray of steel. They plunged deep into the soft, rain-soaked mud of the ravine and erupted upwards, functioning as colossal, improvised geological tools. They were, in effect, man-made volcanoes, and their target was the Third Company. They were joined in this chorus of annihilation by the heavy howitzers, the wheeled monsters positioned miles behind the German lines, their crews working with the mechanical, dispassionate precision of factory workers. The 150mm and 210mm guns, weapons normally reserved for smashing concrete fortresses, were now directed at this single, shallow dirt trench. Their high-angle, arcing fire was perfectly suited to dropping death into the ravine, bypassing the meagre protection of the parapet. The shells did not just strike the trench, they ate it. With each thunderous, ground-shaking impact, the very walls of the trench, already weak, already saturated with the incessant spring rains, already compromised by the decay of buried bodies from previous engagements, simply ceased to exist. They liquefied. They slumped. They collapsed inwards, flowing like a thick, heavy, suffocating tide of mud. The trench was no longer a place of shelter. It had become a suffocating, inescapable, vertical tomb. This was not a bombardment that men could ride out, by crouching low, by pressing themselves against the revetments. This was a geological event, an artificial earthquake that lasted for hours. Tons of earth, shattered rock, splintered wooden supports, and the pulverized remains of previous defenders were thrown hundreds of feet into the air, only to fall back down, burying everything and everyone beneath. The men of the Third Company, the farmers and fishermen holding that specific doomed line of trench, were at the absolute zero point of this calibrated industrial hell. They had no counter-battery fire that could save them. Their own artillery was being hammered, unable to locate the hidden German guns. They had no deep concrete bunkers to hide in, no subterranean galleries to offer respite. They had only the shallow, muddy ditch they had been ordered to hold, a ditch dug by their own hands. And now that ditch was collapsing on top of them, burying them alive, one shell burst at a time. The world for these men was reduced to its most primal, terrifying elements: absolute, mind-breaking thunder, a constant, violent vibration that shook the teeth in their skulls, and the suffocating, acrid smell of cordite, poison gas, and loosened, wet earth. Men were killed in an instant, pulverized by direct hits that left nothing behind. Others were buried completely, suffocating in the dark, their screams unheard just inches beneath their comrades' feet. Others were only partially buried, trapped by tons of debris, forced to wait for the next shell to finish the job. It was an agony that defies civilized description. Then, after hours of this systematic, relentless pulverization, came the silence. A silence almost as terrifying as the noise itself. It was the signal. It meant the shelling was lifting. It meant the infantry was coming. Through the dense, choking clouds of yellow-green gas, black smoke, and pulverized dust, the German infantry attacked. These were the Sturmtruppen of the German 5th Division, the elite assault specialists, men trained for rapid, violent infiltration. They advanced across the cratered, poisoned wasteland, their faces hidden behind the grotesque masks of their respirators, armed with grenades, pistols, and sharpened trench spades for the close-in butchery they expected. They advanced in small, fast-moving groups, expecting to fight for every yard of shattered trench. They expected machine gun fire. They expected grenades. They expected the desperate, suicidal last stand of the French. They found nothing. They found no one. The trench that had housed the 3rd Company of the 137th was gone. It had, as one of the advancing German officers later reported, simply disappeared. It was no longer a recognisable military position. It was just a furrow in the landscape, a long, ugly, smoking scar of freshly turned, wet mud, indistinguishable from the thousands of other shell holes that pockmarked the hellish terrain of the Thialmont sector. The German assault swept over the position, their heavy boots treading on the very ground that now served as a mass, unmarked grave for the men who had been ordered to hold it. The German infantry paused, confused, looking for the enemy they were supposed to be fighting, and finding only devastation. They moved on, pressing their attack toward the next objective, the Thialmont farm itself. The battle simply rolled over this patch of earth. In the French rear, communication with the 3rd Company had, of course, been completely lost hours ago. Telephone lines, long since vaporized by the bombardment, remained silent. Runners sent forward into the Ravin de la Dame never returned, swallowed by the mud and the unending shell fire. The company, its officers, its non-commissioned officers, its Bretons and Vendéans. They had vanished from the battle map. They simply ceased to exist. In the brutal, impersonal mathematics of Verdun, an entire company wiped out, perhaps 250 men, was a tragedy. But it was a common tragedy. It was a statistic. The battle moved on. The Germans captured the Thialmont strong point. The French, in their turn, counterattacked and were slaughtered. The front line shifted a few hundred yards back, then a few hundred yards forward. The great mincing machine continued to turn, day after day, week after week. And in the mud of the Ravin de la Dame, the fate of the 3rd Company was buried, forgotten by all but the earth itself, left to the rats and the rain, an anonymous sacrifice in a war that specialized in them. The war ended. The armistice of November 11th, 1918, brought an almost incomprehensible, deafening silence to the Western Front. The guns, which had roared continuously for more than 4 years, finally stopped, and the great mincing machine of Verdun, the furnace that had consumed 1 million men, at last grew cold. For months the battlefield lay desolate, shrouded in the mists of a bitter winter, a quarantined, forbidden zone of mud, ruptured earth, unexploded ordnance, and the uncounted, unburied dead. But by 1919, as the first tentative poison blades of grass tried to reclaim the wasteland, people began to return. They came in waves, navigating a landscape that no map could any longer describe. There were the official burial details, soldiers given the horrific, soul-crushing task of sifting through the mud for the remnants of their comrades, trying to attach a name, a number, a shred of identity to the shattered bones and rotted cloth. There were the locals, the original inhabitants of villages like Fleury and Douaumont that had been wiped from the face of the earth, returning to stare in disbelief at the overlapping craters where their homes and churches had once stood. There were the scavengers, the récupérateurs, or iron harvesters, who began the decades-long, dangerous work of clearing the Zone Rouge, pulling tons of steel shell casings, barbed wire entanglements, and broken weapons from the grasp of the toxic soil. And then there were the first battlefield tourists, the pilgrims of grief and morbid curiosity, flocking to Verdun to witness the moonscape, to try and comprehend the scale of the sacrifice. They walked in stunned, reverent silence through a world that had been completely unmade, a landscape of interlocking, water-filled shell holes, skeletal, splintered trees, and soil so thoroughly pulverized by high explosives that it resembled a petrified, angry sea. It was in this atmosphere of grim archaeological discovery, in the utterly desolate sector near the Thiaumont farm, itself just a cancerous smear of rubble, that a patrol, or perhaps a burial detail, the exact accounts remain fragmented, stumbled upon the very epicenter of the Third Company's long-forgotten tragedy. They found the vanished trench, or rather, they found what it had become. It was not a discovery that required digging, not at first. It was simply there, protruding from the hard, compacted, rain-washed earth, like some grotesque and final harvest, was a line of rifles. Dozens of them. They were not scattered randomly, not like the usual debris of battle, the discarded equipment of a routed or retreating army. They were in a near-perfect, disciplined line, following the exact, ghostly contour of the obliterated trench. They were angled slightly, uniformly, as if they had been leaning against a parapet, a wall of earth that was no longer there. The wooden stocks of the Liebel model 1886 rifles had largely rotted away in the 3 years of rain and chemical saturation, but the metal barrels, though caked in mud and deeply scarred with rust, remained. And fixed to the end of most of them, pointing defiantly toward the German lines, toward the sky, were the long, cruciform, needle-pointed blades of the Rosalie bayonet. The sight was surreal. It was baffling. It was profoundly, deeply unsettling. It was a violation of the natural order of death. The reports from the initial discoverers are fragmented, coloured by the shock of the moment. Some early accounts claimed there were as many as 50 rifles visible. Others, perhaps more realistically, counted between 30 and 40. But the precise number was irrelevant. What mattered, what seized the imagination of every man who stood there, was the implication. The ground beneath these rifles was hard, compacted, settled by 3 years of rain and time. It had clearly not been disturbed since the moment of the catastrophe. The logical, immediate and utterly terrifying hypothesis formed itself in the minds of the men who stood there, a conclusion that froze their blood. The rifles had not been dropped. They were not discarded. They were still being held. The men of the 137th Infantry Regiment, the farmers from the Vendée, and the fishermen from Brittany were still down there. They were buried just below the surface, their skeletal hands, now dissolved into the mud, still wrapped around the weapons they had refused to abandon in their final moments. They had been standing at the fire step, bayonets fixed, unflinching, ready to meet the German assault, when a single, cataclysmic salvo of heavy Minenwerfer shells had buried them all in one go. The blast had killed them instantly, but it had entombed them standing upright, a silent, spectral garrison still holding the line. This was the only explanation that made sense of the scene. It was a story of almost superhuman, Roman-esque discipline, a final, collective act of defiance that transcended death itself. The discoverers, awestruck and horrified, took photographs. Those grainy, stark, black and white images, showing this impossible line of rusted steel spears jutting from the barren earth, became some of the most haunting and iconic images of the entire post-war period. They were proof. They were a testament. They were a mystery that demanded an explanation. And France, a nation exhausted by bloodshed and desperate for heroes, was about to create one. The grainy photographs and fragmented reports from that desolate ravine did not remain a quiet, grisly curiosity for long. They landed on the desks of newspaper editors in Paris, and in those images they recognized something far more potent than a mere battlefield artifact. They saw a symbol, They saw the story that France, exhausted, traumatized, and bleeding from 1.5 million losses, desperately needed to hear. In 1919, France was a nation victorious, but also a nation broken, haunted by the sheer, grinding industrial scale of the slaughter. The government and the public alike were searching for meaning, for something to sanctify the cost, to prove that the sacrifice had not just been a colossal, meaningless butchery. They needed heroes. They needed legends. And the ghostly rifles of the Ravin de la Dame provided the perfect material. The popular press, led by national newspapers like Le Matin and the widely read illustrated magazine L'Illustration, seized the story and broadcast it to the world. The narrative was forged almost overnight, repeated in countless articles, poems, and speeches until it hardened into undisputed fact. The story was not just that the men of the 137th Regiment had died. It was how they had died. The legend that electrified a nation was built upon a single, shattering detail. They had died standing up. They were not found huddled at the bottom of the trench, cowering from the storm of shells, victims of a simple, tragic collapse. No, the narrative insisted they had been found at the fire step, in full battle order, their Lebel rifles gripped in their hands, their Rosalie bayonets fixed, their bodies rigid, facing the enemy, ready to meet the imminent German assault. They had heard the avalanche of steel approaching, the story went, and they had chosen, as one man, to face it on their feet. The colossal German shells that landed directly upon them did not scatter their bodies. Instead, the blast had triggered a massive landslide of mud and earth that had entombed them instantly, burying them at their posts, standing upright, a silent phantom garrison still guarding the line. This was the story that France embraced. This was the image that was seared into the national consciousness. Those rusted rifle barrels, protruding from the earth like the branches of some terrible, metallic tree, were no longer just relics. They were a final, defiant salute from the grave. They were the ultimate, physical manifestation of General Pétain's immortal command from the battle's darkest days. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. Even in death, the legend proclaimed, these men had not passed. They had become the barrier. They had held the line by fusing their very bodies with the soil of France. This myth provided a powerful, necessary antidote to the anonymous, impersonal horror of Verdun. The grim reality of the battle was the Douaumont ossuary, a colossal, terrifying vault that would soon be filled with the mixed, unidentifiable, shattered bones of 130,000 unknown soldiers, scooped from the battlefield like so much refuse. It was a monument to industrial slaughter, but the tranchée des Bayonets was the opposite. It gave identity, dignity, and a final, heroic agency back to the anonymous poilu. It transformed a horrifying, suffocating, muddy death, a bad death, into a heroic, defiant, almost classical sacrifice, a story worthy of the epic chanson de geste. It reassured a grieving nation that their sons, husbands, and fathers had not died like animals in an abattoir, but as stoic, unconquerable heroes, martyrs to the sacred cause of la patrie. The legend was perfect. It was powerful. And it was exactly what France needed. Soon, this story of impossible, defiant courage would travel across the Atlantic, capturing the imagination of a wealthy American who would ensure that this myth, this essential symbol, would be immortalized not just in newsprint, but in stone and concrete for all time. The story of the men who died standing, a tale of almost mythological stoicism and impossible sacrifice, could not be contained by the borders of a grieving France. It spread, carried across the Atlantic by returning American soldiers, by journalists, and by the sheer, magnetic, horrifying power of its symbolism. It resonated deeply in the United States, a nation that had arrived late to the cataclysm but was now grappling with the cost of its involvement and the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of the European tragedy. Among the millions who read these accounts, who saw the grainy photographs of those ghostly, rusted rifles, was one man who possessed both the profound sensibility to be moved and the immense financial means to act. His name was George T. Rand. Rand was not a politician, nor a general, nor a diplomat. He was a wealthy American banker, a prominent citizen from Buffalo, New York. Like many Americans of his generation, he felt a powerful, almost personal debt to France, the nation that, over a century before, had sent its own soldiers across the ocean to help secure American independence. In the immediate aftermath of the war, in 1919, Rand joined the thousands of battlefield pilgrims who flocked to the Western Front, undertaking a journey that was part tour, part penance, attempting to comprehend the sacrifice they had only read about in the sanitized dispatches. He saw the pulverized ruins of Ypres. He witnessed the desolate, cratered moonscape of the Somme. But it was at Verdun, standing in the cold, damp air of the Ravin de la Dame, staring at that simple, terrifying, impossible line of rifles protruding from the mud, that the story transcended print. He saw what the French saw, not merely a battlefield artifact, but a sacred testament to a form of courage that defied all human instinct, a collective defiance that surpassed nationality and spoke to a universal ideal of duty. He recognized instantly that this fragile, muddy scar on the earth, vulnerable to the elements, to scavengers, and to the inevitable passage of time, must be preserved. Rand, a man accustomed to moving capital and making decisions with swift authority, acted. He approached the French authorities and made an extraordinary gesture. He pledged a sum that, according to most accounts, totaled 500,000 francs. In the early 1920s, this was a staggering fortune, a truly magnificent donation, enough to fund a major civic work. The money was given for a single, specific purpose: to build a permanent, dignified and enduring memorial that would not just commemorate the trench, but physically protect it for all time. It was an astonishing act of international solidarity, a wealthy American ensuring that the sacrifice of these humble French farmers and fishermen would never be forgotten. The commission for this unique and sombre structure was given to the architect André Ventre. The challenge Ventre faced was unlike any other in the history of memorial architecture. This was not about carving a graceful, allegorical statue of victory. This was not about erecting a clean, white obelisk reaching for the heavens. His brief was to build a monument that was also a tomb, a chapel that was also an archaeological site, a structure that could protect the dead without disturbing them. Ventre's solution was one of profound, brutalist genius. He chose not marble, not limestone, but the signature material of the war itself, reinforced concrete. The structure he conceived, which began to rise over the site in 1920, is one of the most imposing and emotionally heavy memorials in the world. It is not a graceful arch. It is a massive, low, heavy slab, a fortress-like structure that seems to press down upon the earth rather than rise from it. It is part bunker, part casemate, part Romanesque chapel, its thick, rough-textured walls echoing the concrete of the very forts, like Douaumont and Vaux, that these men had died defending. It is a structure that speaks the grim, industrial language of the war it commemorates. But the true masterstroke was its placement. The memorial was not built near the trench, it was built directly over it. Ventre designed the monument as a long, crypt-like gallery, a protective canopy. The line of rifles, the bayonets, the very soil that held the men of the Third Company were left entirely undisturbed, frozen in time, sealed in situ. Through large glass panels, visitors could walk the length of the obliterated trench, peering down into the preserved gloom, seeing the rusted barrels still protruding from the earth, just as the burial details had found them. George T. Rand's donation had done more than just pay for a building. It had physically, permanently, and irrevocably sealed the legend in place. It had taken a powerful, emotionally necessary myth and encased it in £500,000 worth of concrete, transforming a piece of raw, contested battlefield archaeology into a government-sanctioned, internationally funded, holy relic. The Trench of Bayonets was no longer just a story. It was now a destination. The concrete of the memorial was barely dry, the ink of the dedication barely faded, when the uncomfortable, necessary work of the state began. The legend had been immortalized, but the men beneath it were still officially disparus. Missing. They were anonymous statistics, and the French army, driven by the desperate pleas of surviving families and a need for official closure, had a duty to identify its dead. The American donation had preserved the myth, but French bureaucracy now demanded the facts. And so, in the early 1920s, and again in subsequent investigations, the earth around and beneath the new monument was carefully, forensically, and somberly probed. This was not a task for poets or journalists. It was a grim, heartbreaking task for veterans of the burial details and the génie, the army engineers. They were not seeking symbolism. They were seeking dog tags, uniform buttons, and human remains. The work was slow, painstaking, and emotionally devastating. The pilgrims who came to see the monument above were honouring a legend. The men working below were exhuming a tragedy. They began the dig. The expectation, set by the newspapers, by the very design of the monument that now loomed over them, was that they would find a garrison frozen in time, that they would uncover the top of a helmet and find a skull beneath it facing east, that they would find skeletal hands still gripping the rifle stocks. They expected to find the men of the Third Company standing. They did not. The truth, when the spades and trowels carefully peeled back the layers of compacted, chemical-laden mud, was infinitely more pathetic and perhaps even more horrifying. The excavators found them. They found the men of the Third Company. But they were not standing. They were not at the fire step. They were not in a posture of defiance. They were found, according to the official reports, in the attitudes of men who had been caught at the very bottom of the trench, seeking the last available sliver of cover from the apocalypse raging above them. They were found lying down. They were found huddled, crouched, compressed, some in the fetal position, their arms thrown over their heads in a futile, instinctive gesture of self-preservation. They were found piled on top of each other, thrown about like discarded dolls, by the sheer concussive force of the blast. The pathology of the site told a story of sudden, cataclysmic violence. These men had not been stoic statues. They had been terrified human beings, killed in the dirt, at the lowest possible point, seeking shelter. The official count remains disputed, clouded by the passage of time and the fragmented state of the remains, but most sources agree that the remains of at least 21, perhaps as many as 23, individuals were identified in this section of the trench. They were found alongside the grim, mundane equipment of the poilus, fragments of their horizon blue uniforms, rotted leather ammunition pouches, canteens, mess tins, and the small, personal talismans they carried for luck. This immediately posed a critical question. If the men were found lying at the bottom of the trench, then what explained the rifles, the very artefacts that had created the legend, which were found standing upright? The investigation team, applying the cold logic of trench warfare, pieced together the final, desperate moments of the Third Company. The heroic myth of men standing defiantly on the parapet was the first casualty. No soldier, not even the bravest Breton veteran, would stand up during a German Minenwerfer bombardment. To do so was not bravery. It was suicide, and it served no tactical purpose. The reality of trench life was the opposite. It was. When the earth-shaking, fluttering whistle of the heavy trench mortars was heard, the immediate, drilled-in, instinctive reaction was to get as low as possible. Soldiers would dive to the trench floor, pressing themselves against the forward wall, praying the blast would pass over them. This was the only chance of survival. And what did soldiers do with their long, cumbersome 9-pound Lebel rifles when they took cover? They did not hold them. They would lean them against the parapet, or more commonly, stack them in what was called a faisceau, a pyramid of 3 or 4 rifles leaned against each other, to keep the muzzles out of the mud. This was standard operating procedure. This was the key. The forensic reconstruction of that moment on June 12, 1916, became chillingly clear. The men of the Third Company were at the bottom of the trench, huddled in terror as the world exploded. Their rifles were stacked in faisceau or leaned against the trench wall, their bayonets, as was common, still fixed. Then came the direct hit, or perhaps a salvo of direct hits. A German heavy mortar shell, weighing 200 pounds, plunged into the soft earth of the trench parapet. The explosion did not just spray shrapnel. It acted as a bulldozer. It vaporized the wall of the trench, instantaneously displacing many tons of wet, heavy earth, which collapsed inwards in a single, suffocating landslide. The men at the bottom, the 21 or 23 men found by the excavators, were buried instantly. They died of asphyxiation, crushed by the sheer, unyielding weight of the mud. They died in the dark, trapped beneath the ground. But the rifles, being taller and leaned against the wall, were caught in the landslide in a different way. The falling earth, compacting around them, held them upright, like pencils jammed into clay, while the men who owned them were buried several feet below. The tops of the barrels and the bayonets remained visible, protruding above the newly settled ground. The soldiers had not been found standing. They had been found trapped, killed, and buried by the very earth they were defending. The legend was beautiful. The reality was a dirty, suffocating, anonymous death, a final, horrifying punctuation mark on the industrial slaughter of Verdun. Here we confront the gap, the chasm between the story France needed to believe and the truth the earth finally surrendered. The excavation had laid bare a reality far more pathetic and infinitely more human than the heroic myth. The legend, which was already being immortalized in poems and newspapers, was clean. It was heroic. It was the story of men facing their fate like the stoic heroes of antiquity, a conscious collective gesture of ultimate defiance. It was, in the grim calculus of war, a good death. But the reality, the one uncovered by the meticulous grim-faced burial details as they sifted the heavy chemical-laden soil, was something else entirely. It was a bad death, une mauvaise mort. It was the death of unimaginable, claustrophobic terror, of being trapped in the sudden, suffocating darkness, of being crushed by the indifferent, impersonal, geological weight of the earth. It was a death devoid of agency, devoid of choice, devoid of any final, defiant gesture. It was a death of pure, industrialized, anonymous horror. A nation, especially a nation that had just sacrificed 1.5 million of its sons, cannot build its national memory on that. It cannot create a unifying symbol from the image of its soldiers found huddled at the bottom of a trench, cowering from the storm, killed like terrified animals in a burrow, suffocating in mud and their own excrement. It must find meaning. It must elevate the sacrifice. The psychology of post-war France, shell-shocked and grieving, demanded a narrative that transformed this unbearable, pathetic end into a conscious, stoic choice. The legend of the men dying while standing upright was not merely a romantic distortion of the facts. It was a profound psychological necessity. It was an act of collective will by the living, a desperate national refusal to accept that the sacrifice at Verdun could be so squalid, so meaningless, so utterly devoid of glory. The myth provided the heroic agency that the reality had so cruelly stolen. It restored dignity to the dead and offered a form of comfort, however illusory, to the millions of living who needed to believe it was all for something. In truth, the 137th Regiment had already performed acts of profound, undisputed heroism. Survivors from the other companies, the men stationed in adjacent trenches who had somehow lived through that day, testified to the intensity of the bombardment. They confirmed the near-total disappearance of their comrades in the 3rd Company. They spoke of the desperate, hopeless counterattacks they had mounted in the following days, trying to retake the ground that was now their brother's grave. The regiment's reputation for courage was never in doubt. They had held the line exactly as ordered, and they had paid the ultimate price for it. Their sacrifice was meaningful. It was heroic. The legend of them standing upright was not needed to prove their valour. Their valour was written in the casualty lists. The legend was needed to sanitize the manner of their death. It was a story told by the living, for the living, because the reality of how the 3rd Company died was simply too terrible to be the final word. But history, especially when it is hardened into a national symbol, is rarely allowed to rest unchallenged. The powerful, solidified legend of the Trench of Bayonets soon attracted its own counter-narratives, investigations driven not by a search for forensic truth, but by cynicism and the shifting political winds of a darkening Europe. As the 1930s dawned and the shadow of another, even more terrible conflict began to loom, a new, calculated version of the story emerged, predictably, from Germany. This countermyth was a clear attempt at political revisionism, a move designed to neutralize a potent French symbol of defiance just as the two nations were rearming, staring at each other once again across the Rhine. The German version of events, published in military journals and circulated by veterans, claimed that the scene was not a symbol of French heroism, but rather one of German battlefield piety. In this telling, after the German stormtroopers had successfully overrun the French position on June 12th, their burial details, the Grabendienst, had respectfully interred the scores of French dead in the collapsed trench. Then, as a rough but honourable military courtesy, they had stuck the fallen soldiers' rifles into the new mound of earth to mark the mass grave. This theory sought to reframe the entire event, transforming a shrine of French defiance into an example of German discipline and battlefield respect. It was a clever piece of propaganda, but it was only that. The theory collapses under the slightest forensic scrutiny. The logic is fundamentally flawed. Why would German burial details, working under the pressure of one of the most intense battles in history, take the considerable, agonizing time and effort to fix the long, unwieldy Rosalie bayonets onto the rifles before planting them? The bayonet was a cumbersome item, usually kept in its scabbard. Burial details would have cleared them as equipment, not carefully affixed them for a funereal display. Furthermore, this narrative failed to explain the physics of the site. The photographs and eyewitness accounts from 1919 describe rifles that were not just superficially stuck in the ground, like markers. They were held fast, embedded deep in earth that had been compacted by 3 years of rain and time, gripped by the very mud that had entombed their owners. A second, even more cynical theory also made the rounds, one that dismissed both French heroism and German piety. This was the theory of the hoax. This version suggested that enterprising locals, perhaps the iron harvesters who scavenged the battlefields for scrap metal, or perhaps the first opportunistic battlefield tour guides, had fabricated the scene entirely, that they had gathered discarded Liebel rifles from the detritus of the battlefield and jammed them into the mud themselves, creating a grotesque and profitable tourist attraction to lure in the curious and the grieving. This too ignores the evidence. It fails to account for the official excavations, which did discover the remains of approximately 21 soldiers clustered directly beneath that exact line of rifles. The scene was not a fabrication, even if the legend that grew from it was an embellishment. Ultimately, the historical consensus rejects both of these convenient countermyths. The German theory was wartime propaganda. The hoax theory was peacetime cynicism. The evidence points back not to a respectful burial, nor to a cynical fraud, but to the catastrophic, instantaneous, physical event of the bombardment. The debate itself, however, serves to obscure the real tragedy, shifting the focus from why these men died to the petty arguments over how their graves were marked. The intense, cynical debates over how it happened, the German revisionist propaganda, the theories of a battlefield hoax, ultimately obscure the one central, undeniable truth. They are distracting footnotes to a much larger, more fundamental and more important question. Why did it matter? What matters is not the precise forensic mechanics of that single, terrible moment on June 12th. What matters is what the trench of bayonets became in the years that followed. It became the single, quintessential symbol of the entire 10-month agony of Verdun. It became the shortcut to understanding. It became the icon. Why this one? Why this shallow, muddy scar in the Ravin de la Dame? Out of all the hundreds of miles of pulverized earth, all the obliterated fortresses, the vanished villages, the countless other identical trenches, where tens of thousands of other men died in equally horrifying, anonymous ways? Why did this specific site ascend from battlefield ruin to national relic? Why not the shattered ruins of Fort Vaux, where Major Raynal and his garrison held out for 6 days, fighting in the dark subterranean tunnels against German stormtroopers, finally surrendering not to the enemy, but to the agonizing, unendurable torture of thirst? Why not the cratered hellscape of Mort-Homme, the Dead Man's Hill on the left bank, a position whose very name spoke for itself, captured and recaptured in a relentless tide of slaughter? The answer, perhaps, lies in its horrifying, perfect, visual simplicity. Verdun, as we have seen, was a battle of total, crushing, industrial anonymity. It was the mincing machine, the furnace. It was a war of statistics, of artillery timetables, of logistical tonnage. Its true, defining monument is the Douaumont ossuary, that colossal, terrifying vault that dominates the skyline for miles. It is a structure that is both a cathedral and a tomb, and through its small, cellar-like windows, one can gaze in stunned silence at the jumbled, unidentifiable, mixed remains of 130,000 men, French and German, piled together in a horrifying soup of bone fragments, skulls, and vertebrae. The ossuary is the macrocosm of the slaughter. It is the industrial scale of the tragedy, cold, vast, and incomprehensible. The trench of bayonets is the microcosm. It is the same horror, the same anonymity, the same industrial obliteration, but captured in a single, intimate, human-scale frame. It takes the abstract, unimaginable number of 130,000 unknown and translates it into a unit that the mind can grasp, a single company of men, a unit you can name. The 3rd Company of the 137th Infantry Regiment. It gives a face, a uniform and a regimental number to the otherwise faceless statistical nature of the sacrifice. This is why it is perhaps even more potent than the tomb of the unknown soldier beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The unknown soldier honours an individual chosen by chance from a lineup of caskets, an abstract symbol to represent all. It is a monument to individual sacrifice. The trench of bayonets is something else. It is a monument to collective sacrifice. It is not one man, but the unit. It is the physical embodiment of the regiment, the company, the section, holding the line as one single, cohesive organism, and dying as one organism, inseparable in their final, terrible fate. And more than any other sight, it perfectly captured the true, essential verb of the entire agonizing 10-month battle. The defining order at Verdun, the phrase that echoed from the high command in Chantilly down to the mud-caked corporals in the Ravin de la Dame, was not attack. It was not advance. It was not maneuver. It was tenir, to hold the line, hold the ridge, hold the fort, hold the scraps of pulverized earth that were all that remained of France, hold at any cost. Ils ne passeront pas. The soldiers of the 3rd Company did not achieve a brilliant counterattack. They did not capture a fortress. They did not win a glorious flanking maneuver. They held. They obeyed their final order. They held the line so stubbornly, so absolutely, that in their final, suffocating moments, they physically became the line. They fused with the very soil of France they had been ordered to defend, their bodies becoming the last gruesome parapet, their rifles the last ghostly palisade. This is what the post-war pilgrims saw. This is what George Rand saw. This is what we, today, must still comprehend. It is an image of duty carried beyond the breaking point, beyond the limits of human endurance, beyond life itself. It is a symbol not of the glory of war. There is no glory here, only rust and mud and concrete, but of its most terrible, profound, and stubborn virtue, endurance. The endurance of ordinary men, of farmers and bakers and fishermen who were asked by their nation to do the impossible, and who, in their final, terrifying moments, did it. The trench of bayonets endures then, not because the legend of the men standing upright is forensically, literally true. It endures because it is metaphorically true. It represents the soul of the battle. It is the one place on earth where the abstract order, hold at all costs, was made terrifyingly, literally, physically manifest. And today, that concrete memorial, that strange, heavy, bunker-like chapel, stands in the now quiet, regrown forests of Verdun, a place of almost suffocating silence. Today, the trench of bayonets stands in the silent, regrown forests of Verdun. It is quiet, almost peaceful, but beneath the heavy concrete slab, those rifles still keep their watch. The legend of the men who died standing, the myth that electrified a nation and inspired an American banker, survived not because it was forensically true. It survived because in the face of the industrial, anonymous, and truly incomprehensible slaughter of Verdun, it had to be true. The human spirit requires meaning. It cannot process the idea of 1 million men dying in the mud for nothing. It cannot accept a death of pure, suffocating, mechanical horror. The myth of the Trench of Bayonets was the answer to that horror. It was a story that returned agency, dignity, and a final, heroic choice to men who had been denied all three. The literal truth of men buried alive while cowering at the bottom of a trench was simply too terrible for a grieving nation to build a monument upon. And so, the legend endures. It is more powerful than the fact. Those bayonets, frozen in concrete, are not just a memorial to the 137th Regiment. They are a monument to the necessity of myth. They are a scar on the face of the earth that refuses to heal, a permanent physical reminder that in the hell of Verdun, the only way to comprehend the scale of the sacrifice was to create a legend equal to it.